Welcome to our channel. In this video, we share content for historical and educational purposes, presented in a way that draws you in and encourages you to see the past from a fresh perspective. Stay with us. Surprising facts and exciting discoveries await. Have you ever wondered what happened to MG42 crews after they surrendered during World War II? Today, we're exploring that question while also uncovering some lesser-known stories from one of the largest military operations in history. But first, let's set the scene. When the MG42 was introduced in 1942, it rapidly became a widely used machine gun within the German military. It accompanied units across multiple fronts, from North Africa to Eastern Europe, and appeared in many fortified positions throughout the conflict. Many people recognize it from historical accounts describing its distinct sound and extremely high rate of fire. Its reliability made it a significant part of World War II narratives. But instead of revisiting technical details, we're looking at what it was like to operate one and what happened to those who served behind it on D-Day. At that time, German leadership believed the strongest defense against an invasion was preventing it from gaining ground at the shoreline. To support that strategy, they constructed fortified positions known as resistance nests along the coast. These structures were arranged so each could support the others with coordinated defensive coverage using cannons and machine guns. On Omaha Beach alone, there were 15 of these carefully positioned strongpoints, many designed to focus their fields of fire along the length of the coastline. This meant that any soldier who managed to avoid one defensive position's field of fire could immediately encounter another. A typical MG42 team included 3 members, a gunner, an assistant who helped load ammunition and replace overheated barrels, and a third member responsible for carrying additional supplies. Many of these crews had experience from earlier stages of the war, but by 1944, some teams also included newer recruits who had not yet participated in major combat operations. Regardless of their experience level, each crew member had a defined role within their assigned position, and on the morning of D-Day, those responsibilities became extremely demanding. What many of these teams didn't realize was that the same equipment that made their positions effective also made them high-priority targets for the advancing Allied forces. In preparation for the landing, Allied planners spent months studying the coastline, identifying defensive structures, and pinpointing fortified positions hidden along the cliffs. Intelligence teams labeled many of these resistance nests by number and location. On paper, the plan was straightforward. Aircraft and naval artillery would heavily weaken the defenses, and the landing forces would advance through the remaining obstacles. But in practice, many of the defensive positions were still active when the landing craft arrived. The naval bombardment early that morning was extensive, with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers providing continuous fire before dawn. They targeted fortified areas along the entire coastline, releasing thousands of shells onto the beaches and surrounding bluffs in an effort to reduce the strength of the defenses. Even with the intense naval bombardment, many fortified concrete bunkers remained structurally intact, allowing several defensive positions to continue operating. The German crews inside understood that a major event was unfolding, and when they finally looked out, they saw hundreds of Allied landing craft approaching the shore. British and Canadian units used specialized armored vehicles, often called Hobart's funnies, to help clear obstacles and address surviving fortifications. The American forces, however, faced significant challenges with the tanks intended to support their landing on Omaha Beach. Their amphibious duplex-drive tanks were meant to arrive alongside the infantry, but out of the 32 launched in the first wave, only a few reached the beach, and very few remained operational once ashore. This left many American troops without the armored support they expected, making the effort to neutralize fortified defensive positions much more difficult. The moment the remaining defensive positions began firing, the situation became extremely intense for both sides. The experience on Omaha Beach was so severe that it continues to be studied and discussed as one of the most challenging moments of the operation. German machine gun crews relied heavily on coordinated tactics that increased the effectiveness of their defensive positions. One common technique involved aiming low to slow down advancing troops, making it harder for them to move forward. This often led additional personnel, such as medics or nearby teammates, to move in and assist, placing even more pressure on the advancing forces. Another tactic involved the use of coordinated fire from multiple positions. For instance, One gun might fire tracer rounds high to give the impression that the aim was off, while another, more concealed gun targeted the main approach path. This simple but coordinated method could momentarily mislead incoming troops and catch them at a disadvantage. These tactics, combined with strong defensive fortifications, contributed to the difficult and chaotic nature of the early hours on the beaches. Once the first waves reached the shore, many of the original plans quickly fell apart, and units had to adapt under extremely difficult conditions. Small groups of soldiers began moving on their own initiative, using any available cover on the open beach. Unfortunately, options were limited, and they often had to rely on tank obstacles, shell craters, and other pieces of scattered debris for protection. Allied training emphasized advancing during the brief pauses when MG42 crews reloaded or replaced overheated barrels. Some officers encouraged their troops to move during those short windows. In one instance, a sergeant organized a small team equipped with a bazooka to target a defensive strongpoint known as WN-61, which had been directing heavy fire across the sand. They managed to disable a 50mm anti-tank gun supporting the position and then moved forward to neutralize the machine gun emplacement. During close quarters fighting around the fortifications, the team overcame several defenders and put two gun positions out of action, while sustaining only minimal losses among their own group. Their efforts helped relieve pressure in that sector and opened a small path inland. Across Omaha Beach, Rangers, engineers, and infantry units made slow, steady progress for hours as they worked to reach and secure fortified positions. At Dog White, Rangers advanced under the cover of smoke and shut down a strongpoint. On the Easy Red sector, engineers cleared obstacles and created safe routes for troops to climb the bluffs, allowing them to approach defensive positions from better angles. However, reaching a machine gun bunker was only the beginning. The most challenging moment often came immediately after closing in. Assault teams typically used grenades or demolition charges to disable the position, and once it was safe to enter, they secured the interior and ensured no remaining threats remained. This process was repeated countless times as troops worked to clear each strongpoint and advance further inland. Once assault teams reached the fortified positions, specialized equipment such as flamethrowers or demolition tools was sometimes used to disable bunkers and make them safe to approach. After the beachhead was finally secured, some German machine gun crews, many of them injured or completely out of ammunition, chose to surrender. However, due to the intense conditions of the landing and the overwhelming stress on all sides, not every surrender attempt was immediately understood or accepted in the chaos of the moment. By early afternoon, momentum had shifted. Groups of U.S. infantry and engineers had made their way up the bluffs, either overcoming or bypassing the remaining defensive positions. An after-action report from Omaha Beach noted that gaining the high ground was made possible largely through the determination and courage of the infantry and engineers, especially after the initial bombardment had not fully disabled the fortifications. Once the MG42 positions were no longer operational, the transformation on the beach was dramatic. Pathways opened, allowing armored vehicles and reinforcements to finally move inland. With key strongpoints no longer able to provide heavy fire, the remaining isolated positions were gradually linked together, and the larger invasion force began advancing farther into Normandy. German MG42 crews continued to operate in the hedgerow regions of Normandy, but never again in such concentrated defensive arrangements, and never again with the potential to halt the Allied advance in a single day. By June 6th, the MG42 had played its full role in the opening moments of the campaign, and the challenging experiences faced by young soldiers on both sides remain deeply remembered in historical accounts. For the Allied infantry involved in the first wave, encountering the MG42 was extremely overwhelming. Many of them were new to frontline conditions and had never been exposed to such intense fire before. Even before reaching the beach, they could hear the machine gun's rapid, distinctive sound, described by some as similar to tearing fabric or a fast-moving power tool, echoing across the water. Veterans later shared that the sound of the MG42 alone was intensely stressful, often leaving new soldiers momentarily frozen in place. When the landing craft ramps dropped, the natural reaction for many was to hit the ground and stay low. One U.S. squad leader recalled urging his team to keep moving, reminding them that staying still on an open beach was even more dangerous. Across the wide shoreline, everyone knew they were completely exposed. Army medic Ray Lambert later described how the conditions made it extremely challenging for troops trying to make it through the surf, and some units struggled to reach the sand at all. On Dog Green sector, one company experienced extremely heavy losses within minutes. Yet even in that chaos, many kept advancing, some because of orders, some from a sense of responsibility, and others simply because moving forward felt like the only option. From the German machine gun positions, the experience was also overwhelming, but in a very different way. At strong point WN-62 above Omaha Beach, 20-year-old Heinrich Severloh, often referenced in historical accounts, was awakened before dawn as the invasion began. By first light, he was manning his MG42 and looking out over the English Channel at an enormous sight, hundreds of ships and thousands of troops approaching the coast. As the first landing craft came within range, several defensive positions began firing. Over the next 9 hours, Severloh went through a large amount of ammunition as he attempted to carry out his assigned role. At one point, he was left to operate the gun alone, and the defensive position around him steadily weakened as the battle continued. He later described feeling overwhelmed as the situation unfolded, noting that the advancing troops continued forward despite the intense conditions. By early afternoon, with the position failing and his ammunition depleted, he left the bunker and attempted to retreat inland. His withdrawal became a difficult journey through the damaged terrain until he finally reached safety after nightfall. The next morning, now surrounded by U.S. troops, he surrendered, careful not to mention that he had been operating a machine gun position during the landing. Many others did not get that opportunity, as numerous defensive crews were unable to leave their bunkers, and those who were captured were often surprised to be treated humanely after such an intense battle. For both sides, the experience left lasting emotional impacts. Allied veterans later said they could never forget the sound of the MG42, while German veterans often spoke about the difficult moments and faces that stayed in their memory long after the war ended. Neutralizing an MG42 position was far from the smooth, step-by-step process shown in training manuals. It required getting extremely close, sometimes only a few meters away, all while under sustained defensive fire. Every step forward carried enormous risk, and many service members were unable to reach their objective despite getting very close. Once assault teams reached the entrance of a bunker, the final moments of securing it were extremely fast and stressful, usually ending within seconds. For the machine gun crews inside, these were the situations they feared most. The same armored firing ports that protected them from the front also limited their ability to move or retreat once the Allies broke through the outer defenses. For the machine gun crews, the final moments inside a bunker came with extremely difficult choices. Their options were limited: continue holding their position or attempt to surrender, and neither possibility felt reassuring. MG42 teams knew they were considered high-priority targets because of the significant impact their positions had on the battlefield, and many feared how they might be treated once captured. Most Allied troops followed the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention and accepted prisoners as required. But historical accounts describe moments in the intense chaos of battle where emotions ran very high. Soldiers who had just experienced heavy losses sometimes struggled to remain calm or impartial, making those situations unpredictable and stressful for everyone involved. It's important to remember that not all German machine gun crews were experienced fighters or deeply committed to the regime. Some were conscripts from various regions, serving under strict orders and often acting out of fear rather than conviction. In several cases, these individuals surrendered quickly once their position became untenable. Others continued fighting, sometimes because they believed surrender might not help them or because they were simply overwhelmed by the situation. The mental strain of being inside a fortified position was enormous. Crews could hear the advancing troops getting closer, footsteps above them, and the sounds of nearby explosions. Many described waiting for the moment the bunker would be breached as one of the most stressful experiences of their lives. And when the fighting finally ended, the aftermath was not always the sense of relief they hoped for. While most prisoners during the Normandy campaign were treated according to international standards, there are a few historical reports that suggest isolated incidents of mistreatment occurred amid the confusion of the larger battle. These accounts are not representative of widespread behavior, but they do reflect how intense and emotionally overwhelming the situation was for everyone involved. Incidents like these were rarely recorded in detail, partly because they could have drawn public attention to moments when the rules of warfare were not clearly followed. They were also overshadowed by the much larger outcome, a major Allied victory that opened a new front in Europe and helped lead to the war's end. And there were many aspects of the battle that soldiers simply never felt comfortable discussing afterward. For many MG42 operators who survived D-Day, the end of the war did not erase the memories of that morning. Some, like Heinrich Severloh, returned to towns and farms that looked almost unchanged, yet carried experiences they struggled to put into words. Severloh spoke very little about Omaha Beach for decades, but the emotional weight stayed with him. Years later, he reached out to families of fallen comrades and even met David Silva, a U.S. veteran he had wounded during the battle. The two men, once fighting on opposite sides, eventually sat together and talked. It was a moment neither could have imagined in 1944, but it offered a small sense of understanding and closure for both. Many other German veterans lived quiet post-war lives and rarely mentioned their time behind the MG42, except in private conversations with fellow former soldiers. For them, the weapon represented both professional responsibility and complex emotions tied to the events they endured. The MG42 became remembered as a symbol of the intensity of battle, something no one who encountered it ever forgot. In memoirs, when a veteran wrote that a machine gun began firing, it was often the MG42 they were referring to. Films like The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan later introduced its distinctive sound to new generations, and today, the remaining bunkers along the Normandy coast still stand as historical reminders of its impact and of the long-lasting effects the battle had on everyone involved.